Rachel?
It's a crime this horrific. It's hard to sit in here, hear the proof that we've heard, see the evidence that's been presented, and to remain unscathed. I think all of us who had to sit through the state's case and hear about the horrible, despicable acts and crimes that were committed against Channing Christian and Christopher Newsom are going to remember this for the rest of our lives. We've seen the horror and pain in the eyes of strong, good men and women in this case who have taken the stand and who will testify about what happened. So no argument there. This was an absolute, disgusting, and despicable act. These are the acts of Marcus Davidson, Thomas Cobbins, Vanessa Coleman, and George Thomas. In opening, we talked about how the state of Tennessee has spent millions of dollars and tested nearly every piece of physical evidence in their quest to catch the killers. Evidence was tested and retested. It's a huge stack this big. The state introduced all the different testing that has been conducted in this case. At the end of it, what does this evidence show us? LaMarcus Davidson's prints are on a bank envelope in her car and on a Blockbuster card. We've heard that evidence. His prints were on the trash bags. And when I say he, I mean LaMarcus Davidson's fingerprints are on the trash bags that surrounded Channing Christian's body. A hair was found on her body that could be attributed either to LaTalvis or LaMarcus, because it being a hair without the root, it's only DNA that we could get from it was mitochondrial DNA. We know that LaMarcus Davidson's DNA was found in her anus and also in her vagina. And LaCalvis Cobbin's sperm was found on her shirt, on her leg, and in her mouth. We also know that .22 caliber long rifle bullets were found everywhere. And those are the bullets that killed Christopher Newsom. Those bullets were found in Kentucky. Those bullets were found multiple places at Chipman Street. They were even found in the drains of the sinks at there. And we know that LaMarcus Davidson and LaTalvis Cobbins had revolvers that were capable of firing those rounds. Now, General Morton said that gun's not been recovered, but that's not exactly what the testimony was from the state's expert. She said she can't definitively rule it out as being the murder weapon. And specifically, now the one in Kentucky that LaTalvis had, that one she was pretty confident wasn't. But the one that was found right next to Mr. Davidson when the police went in there and jerked him through the window and brought him into custody, now that gun certainly could not be excluded as being the murder weapon. We also know that Vanessa Coleman's DNA was found on long strips of cloth with Shannon's blood on it, found near the knot end of that. And certainly, the significance of that, I would submit, is that these are part of the bindings that were used on Shannon. And obviously, Ms. Coleman was involved in binding her. Again, the state has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that LaMarcus Davidson, LaTalvis Cobbins, Vanessa Coleman, and George Thomas were responsible for these murders. What about the case against Eric Boyd? Let's talk about that a little bit. We've heard from this army of experts. We've got 7 experts. Experts of cell phone towers, experts dealing with firearms, DNA experts. We've heard from many, many people that the state has called in this case. And again, at the end of it, there is no physical evidence that ties Eric Boyd to the rape, to the murder, to the thefts, or to the robberies. We do have a holster found in his cousin's car that has DNA that is consistent with Eric Boyd. I'll comment about that in a moment. And then we also know that his clothes that were taken from his body by the police have Eric Boyd's DNA on them. But we also know that those clothes do not have any DNA from any of the other people involved in this, including the victims in this case. And listening to General Morton go through his closing arguments and telling you and narrating what they believe occurred, the state's case is a lot of speculation. They have a narrative that they have come up with about what happened, and in their version of events, Eric Boyd is the only means of transportation these people have. But have we really heard proof to that? Certainly they were down here, they were at Chipman Street, but we haven't heard any proof that he brought them anywhere. What do we know in this case? Well, we know that right after these crimes were committed, that LaTalvis Cobbins, Vanessa Coleman, and George Thomas fled Knoxville after the murders of Chris and Shannon. We know that the police had to chase them down to Kentucky and ultimately apprehend them. We also know that the sheriff and Sheriff Hutchinson and former Sheriff Johnson got on a helicopter, went up there. And when they get to Kentucky and they talk to George Thomas, that's when the narrative that Eric Boyd is guilty first gets planted in this case. George Thomas made statements to the police in which he minimized his involvement and which he blamed Mr. Boyd. But again, let's remember these statements Mr. Thomas supposedly made back in 2007. Just remember that for the significant details about what transpired in January of 2007, where did the details come from? They didn't come from Mr. Thomas. The details came from the detectives. Yeah, the SUV being there, that came from the detectives. Hey, remember a short, bald-headed, light-skinned black dude showing up over there. Where did that come from? That didn't come from Mr. Thomas. That comes from the detectives. Call him E. It's the detectives placing him there. Again, you remember a point where Slim and E and Rome were all left together in Slim's car, and E's car and you stayed there, you and Vanessa Saturday night? There's about 5 statements telling exactly what happened. Okay, all right, at some point in time, white SUV came back with Slim and E, and Rome was driving E's car. Do you remember that? And you came out on the front sun's porch, remember that? Those aren't statements, Mr. Thomas. This is the narrative that the police, in their investigation, give them the benefit of the doubt, this is the narrative of what they believe happened. Mr. Thomas is going to agree with it. Again, I think we do have to look at what was going on 12 years ago. I know General Morton made some reference to it. But 12 years ago, when these crimes were first committed, this community was up in arms. I know from the people who were here, they can remember that. At that point in time, in reviewing the evidence that they had before them, the state made the decision that they were not going to charge Eric Boyd, and it was because they looked at the weight of the evidence that they had against him, and they made the decision not to charge him. The community wanted the people caught. The community wanted them convicted. The community wanted them dead. But the state looked at it and made that decision. And then last year, the state made a devil's bargain with George Thomas to come in here. And I think probably in large part, the idea was that he was going to answer the questions, to put in those last pieces of the puzzle that General Morton was referring to answer the questions which the family really wanted to know about what happened with his kids. We've all heard his testimony. We've all heard what he had to say. Certainly, Mr. Thomas is going to get the benefit of his bargain as far as, well, that's up to the state. And I think we remember this is the same man that says, "Fuck that white girl, she didn't mean anything to me." Again, Mr. Thomas says, well, that was taken out of context. I'm not exactly sure what context he was referring to. Let's talk a little bit about what is the state's key evidence that they have against Mr. Boyd. What is this? Well, it's probably the first witness to talk about is Xavier Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, of course, is just working. Comes there and is minding his own business and sees commotion going on at 2316 Chipman Street. What did Mr. Jenkins also say? Well, initially he reports the SUV. Of course, he sees the SUV pass him later on that evening. He says, General Morton said that he saw 4 black males, but again, when I asked him some questions, he said, I saw 4 silhouettes that I assumed to be black males in the vehicle when they passed me. Again, he said he didn't see the features of anybody, but he saw 4 silhouettes in the car. Now, and of course he testified that later on the next day they saw the car parked over by the train tracks, and you know, they went to go see if there were any kids in it. There weren't. It was empty. They went back to work, and that's what he initially says. And then we have, shortly before the federal trial, federal prosecutors go out to talk to Mr. Jenkins. In October of 2007, they go out to talk to him. That's 9 months after he witnessed these events. And they ask him about, hey, did you see any other cars out there? Why, yes, I did. I saw a white car with a little red pinstripe that was sitting out there. Now, let's again look at what we're talking about. Mr. Jenkins is over in this parking lot, 2316 Chipman Street is over there. He says he's sitting sort of catty corner. It is at nighttime. There is going to be light in this area and light over here, residential. He says that he saw the lights on at the house. He testified that that was about 300 yards, a football field away. And from that distance, at that time, sitting catty corner, not particularly paying a whole lot of attention to whatever's going on at 2316 Chipman Street, because of course he has no reason to think there's anything going on at 2316 Chipman Street. He sees that white Pontiac Sunbird with that little thin red stripe from that distance, and that he remembers that 9 months later. Some pretty incredible perception and recollection. Now, I just want to be clear about this. I'm not saying for an instant that Mr. Jenkins is lying or that he is intentionally trying to say something that he believes is false. This case, as we know, was a huge media event. Pictures of the individuals who were involved in this case were broadcast and rebroadcast. We know vehicles were broadcast and rebroadcast. This case saturated the airwaves for years. Mr. Jenkins says that he did not watch any more media coverage at all after the first reports that showed the 4Runner, which he recognized and said, hey, that's the car that I saw. He says he didn't see any pictures of the Pontiac or pictures of Mr. Boyd that were broadcast on the local news. He says he didn't see any of those. Again, that's just something we're going to, I guess y'all have to decide in considering how much weight to give his evidence. Because certainly it would make sense if they're broadcasting and rebroadcasting and that Sunbird is on TV, why Mr. Jenkins may be able, 9 months later, to pick out a car that he saw from a football field away. I think what I can also would like to point out that testimony of Danielle Lightfoot, one of the last people that we heard from in this case, that she testified that Daphne Sutton also drove a little white Pontiac car and had given her a ride over to a hairdresser. So that might be another explanation for that white car. Then the state's other key witness, that being George Thomas. Again, the state said that they were going to bring you someone from the inside to answer the questions about what happened at 2316 Chipman Street. Y'all heard it. What do we know about Mr. Thomas? Well, we know that he and LaTalvis Cobbins are best friends. We know that he and LaTalvis were present during the abductions, rapes, and murders, and that after the crimes were committed, they fled to Kentucky. We know that in Kentucky, they're caught with Shannon's property. When they talk to the police, both implicate Eric Boyd. But neither LaMarcus nor Vanessa Coleman implicate him. Details about E, those come through, again, the investigators, the interviewers. And George runs with the ball. Again, he's loyal to LaTalvis. He doesn't know Eric Boyd. He doesn't know him. He's loyal, so loyal to him that he doesn't even directly implicate LaTalvis in the crimes that took place at 2316 Chipman Street. Even when he testified the other day, he didn't implicate his best friend. Well, let's look at some of the statements, various statements that Mr. Thomas has made. The type of gun changes. When he talked to investigators back in 2007, he said, it's a revolver. And here, it's an automatic. His story about who took Chris Newsom changed. His original statement was LaMarcus Davis and Eric Boyd, and then it changed to, well, it's just Eric Boyd, and then now it's, well, it was me and Eric Boyd. He told us that LaMarcus Davidson and Eric Boyd go into the front room with Shannon Christian. And y'all heard on cross. That's different, and that conflicts directly with what he told investigator Childress just a year ago about what happened. He also now says that Eric Boyd was alone with Shannon Christian while he, LaMarcus Davidson, Vanessa Coleman, LaTalvis Cobbins went on a trip. Driving around, they went over to Benson's house. And while that's going on, and they're going to Benson's house, back over at 2316 Chipman Street, Eric Boyd is sitting with Shannon Christian, I guess, committing the crimes? I don't know. He's sitting there with her. And again, that directly conflicts what he told Investigator Childers when they made this agreement for him to come in here and testify a year ago. Now, the state, if you'll notice, they didn't call any witnesses to rebut that part of my cross-examination of Mr. Thomas, that statements made to Investigator Childers didn't match with what his testimony in here the other day was. They didn't call Investigator Childers to rebut that. They didn't call anybody. But they did whenever we talked about the statement back down in Kentucky. They brought the sheriff in, former sheriff in here to rehab his statements from Kentucky. According to Mr. Thomas, he didn't see anything. He didn't hear anything. And y'all heard him. He didn't think he should be charged. He didn't think he should have been charged for this, for his involvement. Does it make any sense to anybody sitting in here that that man could have been at that tiny little house while Shannon was being brutalized and raped, and that he didn't see anything, that he didn't hear anything, while his best friend is feet away raping her? It just doesn't make any sense. And let's look at his story about Chris. What does he tell us about this? Roll up, real quick, roll up. They're there a few minutes. Grab him, hey, you, go with him, go take him out there. They go out to the railroad tracks, go out there for a few minutes, takes him behind some bushes for a minute, doesn't tell us how long, not for very long. Sees 3 flashes, sees him drag him over there, grabs a gas can, which has miraculously appeared in the back of the 4Runner, throws the gas on him, sees a big whoosh. This is what he tells us. It's one of the things that we know. We know from Dr. Malushin that the rape happened 2 hours before the murder. I know the state says, well, it happened way before they even got there. But let's also look at some of the other things. What do we have 50 yards to 80 yards away from the railroad tracks? We've got a lot of fabric. Fabric which the state has shown matches with the bindings that were used for Shannon, and some of the bindings that were found where Chris was hurt. Those bindings are significant. Y'all might have lost them as all the evidence was coming in here. But I submit those bindings are significant because those bindings were used in both Chris and Shannon. Those bindings came from that house at 2316 Church Street. Those bindings came from Michael Freeman, who gave them when Marcus Davidson and Daphne Sutton moved into that tiny little house. That's where they came from. Those bindings were cut up somewhere. Those people were bound with them somewhere. It's at 2316 Chipman Street. It happened right there. I'd submit it happened to both of them in that tiny little house in front of anybody who was in there. That comforter that matches those sheets and matches those bindings came from inside 2316 Chipman Street. That comforter that wrapped him before they burnt him, which is absent, completely absent in Mr. Thomas's account of what happened. All that went down there. What testified to doesn't make sense. I know y'all are going to see these jury instructions. And in general, there's two kind of lawyers who do argument. Many will talk about the jury instructions. We want to spend a whole lot of time talking about jury instructions. I obviously come from a different camp. I think it's the first time I've even mentioned the jury instructions to you. But there is an instruction that you will get that deals with accomplice. Now, the judge is going to tell you that you're to consider Mr. Thomas an accomplice of the crime. Okay? Not necessarily an accomplice of Mr. Boyd. That's a fact that y'all are going to have to decide for yourself. But he's an accomplice to the crime. If a witness was an accomplice in the crime, then his testimony must be corroborated. Okay? Corroborating evidence is evidence entirely independent of the accomplice's testimony, which taken by itself leads to an inference not only that a crime has been committed, but also that the defendant was implicated in it. This independent corroborative testimony must include some fact or circumstance that affects the defendant's identity. Corroborative evidence may be directly or entirely circumstantial, and it need not be adequate in and of itself to support a conviction. Okay? I'll read the entire instruction, because if I don't, Gerald Fitzgerald will. But the rest of the instruction goes on to say it is sufficient if the corroborative evidence fairly and legally tends to connect the defendant with the crime charge. It is a question for the jury to determine whether an accomplice's testimony has been sufficiently corroborated. In this case, the court charges you that the witness, George Thomas, was an accomplice to this alleged crime. And before the defendant can be convicted, you must find that this accomplice testimony is sufficiently corroborated. This is a different instruction than you're going to get for any of the other witnesses in this case. This is specific to him. For the other witnesses, they go through there, and you'll see. Again, you're going to have this read to you in just a few minutes, but it's a different instruction that you get from Mr. Thomas. Now, let's talk about, and I said that I'd come back to this, but let's talk about the holster. DNA on the holster. Well, first of all, I'd submit it's his cousin's car. There's a holster found in there. Whatever significance you find. But I do want to at least point this out. If you all remember, we're going through different DNA evidence, different people, and one of the things that you heard more than once is that the probability of an unrelated individual having the same DNA profile, and they went through a number of different populations, but I'm sure that you couldn't help to have noticed that there were many times that they said exceeds the world's current population. It's in a way of saying the numbers are so big, we're not even going to run them for you, but that's the guy. This one, I do want to at least point out that in the African American population, okay, we're dealing with odds 1 in 5,714. Those the DNA evidence, guys, pretty low odds. And we're talking about we've got DNA over here, and we can chances that it's somebody else exceeds the world's population, and chances that it's somebody else is 1 in 5,714. Those are much, much better odds than playing the lottery. Now, these crimes were and are horrific. I mean, we keep stating it, General Morton keeps stating it, I keep stating it. Y'all have sat through it, you know this, we've seen this. And I know that you are going to want to find somebody guilty for the murders of Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom. It's only natural. You've sat through this and you had to hear about the suffering that these two kids went through. General Morton pointed out, some of the additional horrors of what they must have gone through. Anger is a natural reaction. for what it's worth, I'm angry about what happened to these kids. I'm sick and disgusted about the actions of LaMarcus Davidson and his cohorts. But again, they have each been rightfully convicted for their part in the crimes. We can't let anger lead us to a choice that we may later regret. You know, at some point in time, the passions that we're feeling in here, the anger, the sick, the disgust, the hurt, all that is going to pass away. We're going to have to look at ourselves about the decision that we're making in this case. Don't let your anger make that decision for you. Make it based on the evidence that's been produced by the state. You know what the system calls for. If we're going to find a person guilty, the state has to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not just that we think this guy did it. It's not even that we're pretty sure that this guy did it. It's not even that we're almost positive that he did it. It's beyond a reasonable doubt as to the guilt. The state is asking you to send a man to prison for the rest of his life based on the testimony that George Thomas gave last week. A man who's changed his story after hearing the state's proof twice. He's sat through this twice. He's heard from these witnesses twice. Those details that the state's so proud of that he's giving us, he's heard the state's evidence twice. We're asking you to hold the state to its burden. And I'm asking you to find Eric Boyd not guilty. Thank you.